All right, welcome everyone. Um, NSA has a monthly talk series as a part of its larger academic engagement. And for this October talk event, we have a topic called the materiality of the social mobility in Himalayan small towns. And it's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker, Dr. Rohit Negi. Uh, Dr. Rohit Negi is Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Director of the Center for Community Knowledge at Ambedkar University, Delhi. And his interests are in urban and environmental change with regional specialization in India and Southern Africa. His new co-authored book entitled Atmosphere of Collaboration, Air Pollution Science, Politics, and Ecopreneurship in India has been recently published by Routledge. And Rohit is also the co-editor of Space Planning in Everyday Citizenship in India, which is a publication of Springer. And his writings have appeared in several journals, including Geoforum, Journal of Southern Africa Study, Urbanization, and EPW. And he is very much a part of this imaginative and exciting interdisciplinary program called Urban Studies in Ambedkar University, Delhi, where the thrust is on studying the urban planning and policy through the spaces, life realities, ecology and experiences of the global south and the margins. And he's going to speak on the experiences of Himachal Pradesh and the relevance of the experiences of places like Himachal Pradesh for Northeastern region can hardly be understated, considering the parallels in terms of the landscape, ecology, and social lives, and etc. And if we talk about the influx of capital in Northeastern region, it goes as far as back as the colonial time. And in the contemporary time, we are observing that increased escalated mode of influx of this capital in the region. And it provides a very kind of a rich field of study in terms of looking at how this particular emphasis on urbanization through this influx of the capital impact the life of the social classes or the community life and so on and so forth in the region. And today's talk is going to be chaired by our very own member, Dr. Raile Rocky Ziipao, who is an assistant professor of sociology at IIT Bombay. Dr. Ziipao was the 2017 and 18 Raghunathan Family South Asian Fellow at Harvard University. And his research interest includes socio-anthropology of infrastructure, sociology of development, indigenous tribal studies, and Northeastern Indian studies. And his work has been published in the Journal of South Asian Development, Asian Ethnicity, Strategic Analysis, EPW, and in multiple edited book chapters. And he's the author of the recent book called The Infrastructure of Justice, State and Politics in Manipur and Northeast, which was published by Routledge in 2020. So with those introductory words, I hand over the session to Dr. Raile Ziipao.
Thank you so much, Mr. President. And as Dr. Nixon has already laid the background for the discussion, now I may invite Dr. Rohit Negi to take your time.
Thank you, Dr. Ziipao. I'm just going to project the presentation to the screen so that everyone can see it. I think it should be up, right? Excellent. So thanks so much, our colleagues, the Naga Scholars Association, Dr. Nixon, Dr. Ziipao, and others for join us. So basically, just to give you a little bit of a background, the work that basically goes into this paper that I'm going to present today has been going on for a while, for about 6 years now. And it's one of those, projects which are not really tied to specific funding or any particular sort of collaboration. Rather, it's one of those projects which is very close to one's heart. And so you continue thinking, you continue working as and when you get the time, as when you can, put together some resources, and therefore it's sort of a labor of love in a sense. If some of you might be interested in the two outputs that we already have out from this long-term research, I encourage scholars here to refer to or to read this paper that is cited here. It was published in the journal Urbanization, and it's on a small town in Kullu district of Himachal Pradesh. And we also made a film, a short film, which is around 25 minutes long, which really we made for students. It sort of goes along with the paper, and it's sort of visual. It's good, easy to visualize, and so on. So, having done some of the preliminary work in just trying to understand what's going on around us in terms of changing geographies, changing landscapes, economic as well as urban landscapes, we wanted to, or rather I and some colleagues that I've been in discussion with, we wanted to actually move beyond that a little bit and start to ask more nuanced questions on what's going on. Therefore, to that extent, just a second. Yeah. Therefore, to that extent, we started to think more seriously about the question of temporality or time in these settlements. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. So, but I begin today with the story of four brothers, Praveen, Sanjay, Sandeep, and Vijay, in their 30s and 40s, who are from this agri-pastoral Gaddi community and who live in the urbanizing settlement of Bharmor in Himachal Pradesh. It's in district Chamba of Himachal Pradesh. Father inherited an old house in the village, which he took down in the early 1970s to build a new wooden house using the same material, but with more rooms and new elements like taller and wider doorways. The house was divided amongst the brothers in 2007 after their father's demise, with each inheriting a room. As they got married and had children, the accommodation, of course, became cramped. A few years later, three of them pooled money to build a new 3-floor concrete structure adjacent to the old house. When we met them in late 2017, Sanjay, who runs a shop in Bharmor, and Praveen, who is a contractor working on government projects, told us about their plans to build a hotel nearby for visitors who pass through Bharmor during the annual Mani Mahesh Yatra, or pilgrimage to Lord Shiva's abode in the Dhauladhar mountain range nearby. Sandeep, the third brother, an engineer in a parastatal living with his family in Haryana, wants to build a larger independent house in Bharmor. The fourth, Vijay, had fallen upon tough times, and his family continued to occupy their room in the old house. It took him 6 more years to finally construct his own floor above the brothers' structure, comprising of 2 bedrooms, kitchen, and a bath, but with visibly poorer finishing and less expensive materials than the other units. So Vijay's floor in this new house, though, fortuitously turned out to be at the same level as his older accommodation. This allowed him to merge the 2 walls and create a direct connection between the 2 units. Showing this connected doorway to us with pride, Vijay claimed, "I alone have this privilege." So scholars like Jonathan Rigg have invited researchers to turn attention to the increased decoupling of rural poverty and well-being from agriculture and other traditional livelihoods, and to the observed highly mobile and delocalized lives and livelihoods across the global south. Now, these shifts are not accidental by any means and draw on the work of development policy and capital. In this context, the state of HP, Himachal, has been hailed as an exemplar. Education, as you know, in Himachal is nearly universal. Public healthcare, especially primary level healthcare, is widely accessible, and poverty has declined sharply in the last 3 decades to 1/3 of the national average. So the question we are asking in this larger project is, while there is undeniable, though uneven, social mobility across the region and economic mobility across the region, what of its spatiotemporality? as to paraphrase Sharachari, as subalterns accumulate capital, where and how is it fixed? And how do these processes reconfigure rhythms of life? These questions follow the transposition of what Gyan Prakash termed now some while back, the urban turn in critical inquiry. What's happened is that increasingly the inquiry into the urban has moved from metropolitan areas also to the ordinary and relatively off the map settlements. Lately, interest in India's non-metros has flourished, spanning the urban peripheries, Mufassal towns in North India, census towns elsewhere, and more generally, as Mukhopadhyay et al. Term subaltern urbanization, which the authors describe as the naming of, I quote, vibrant smaller settlements, spaces outside of the metropolitan shadows, sustainably supporting a dispersed pattern of urbanization. Benefiting from regional economic growth, such towns draw on activities like paratransit, services around cell phones, private education, and private healthcare, among other things. As such, it is seen across contexts that, and I quote from our earlier paper, that individuals and families increasingly view their future in part as urban, no matter where their lives actually unfold. A strong interweaving of the rural, especially the historical, agricultural, or pastoral, or other social relations with the emergent urban process has also been observed by scholars. So alongside this conceptual reworking of the urban towards the small, the overlooked, there has also been a refreshing interest in the spatiality of change in the Himalayan region, with insightful work on built environments and infrastructures, on metabolic flows, waste, for instance, and on the environmental aspects of change. The rapid changes in our place of interest, Bharmor, as well as its concretization or aspects that are also observed across the region. And one paper that I'm thinking about is by Duncan McDuera and Mona Chetri on Sikkim, which provides a culturally unique and environmentally fragile context to the urban process. Following this scholarship, this talk today will stitch together literatures on the spatio-temporalities of urbanity, the Himalayan urban, and on the shifting dynamics of the local pastoralist society of Chamba. Now, the ethnographic vignette that I shared above earlier maps the conceptual contours of this research agenda. It shows the uneven economic mobility. Just amongst the brothers, there are different trajectories that have taken shape. The material reconfigurations, them investing in the structures, emergent temporalities, different timelines through which they build and occupy and inhabit homes, and also divergent ideas of the future, futurities. Each of the four brothers, like I said, is economically better off than their father, who served as a soldier in the army and then a guard at a local bank after retirement. Despite the hardships, the parents managed to educate all the children and ensured some kind of generational mobility. At the same time, the trajectory of Vijay shows, the difference in these trajectories, like I just said. Still, the increased surplus in the hands of many in the region, like this family, finds its way into the regional towns, leading to their material reconfiguration as housing density and many kinds of commercial activities expand. I'm sure to those of you who have traveled in the northeastern region, you might also recognize some of these things. Having replaced wood and stone construction that was earlier pervasive, concrete is now the ubiquitous artifact and symbol of these developments. But buildings vary in size, in strength, in paint, tiling, fixtures, depending on the particular family's savings and the access to the skills required to finesse the desired aesthetics. Some buildings are constructed at one go, others take longer, while still others never reach a state of habitation even after years, producing different temporalities, like I said, to the urban process. Finally, having begun their life stories in the same home, the four Gaddi brothers are architects of and participants in divergent futurities. Sandeep sees Bharmor as a summer home after retirement from his government posting. Praveen and Sanjay see it as a bundle of economic opportunities and therefore plan to construct a new hotel together, while Vijay is content right now with the relative stability that his new job promises to him. So by attending to social spatial change through the element of time, this paper examines the multiple scales at which it operates in Bharmor. At the meta scale, we find the entanglements of what I call the historical, mythological, the developmental, and state cap time. These multiple temporalities sometimes overlap neatly, but their intersections are also fraught, producing frictions and disturbances. At the micro scale, the paper outlines the different kinds of building in Vermont. That is, building as seasonal, smooth, or incremental process that produce a very diverse landscape and differential experiences of inhabiting the town. The paper also shows how ideas about the future, in part as external force to be reckoned with, and in part as an aspiration, inform residents' decisions and actions in the present. Together, Vermore's temporalities follow what I've been sort of working with this concept of transhumant urbanity, or the deep structuring of urban rhythms by the regional history of transhumant pastoralism, even when most people are not engaged in it anymore. This temporality continues to be important in the otherwise powerful time of capital, showing the extent to which historical human ecological relations matter to otherwise fast changing small towns. The work draws on 6 months of fieldwork in the settlement between 2017 and 18, with three main methodologies: spatial mapping, questionnaire, and in-depth interviews. Let me not go into it too much here because I've been trying to, shorten the paper from 10,000 to something close to 4,000 for today. But here it is anyway. I can answer any questions about this if there are. So, situated at an altitude of around 7,000 feet, Vermore is the homeland, the Gadan as it's called, of the Gadi community. And the settlement by the same name, Vermore itself, is the center of the region. This urbanizing village is clustered around the 7th century temple complex called the 84 temple complex, or simply as Chaurasi, which is the Pahadi or Hindi word for 84. The Gadan is spiritually adorned and known widely as the abode of Lord Shiva, and the Gadi is chosen people. As a scholar notes, in the Gadan, the divine is landscaped and the landscape is made divine. The Gadi Pastoralist Society operates with a seasonality such that the summers are spent by the pastoralists in the upper reaches of the Himalaya, the winters in the plains to the south, and the intervening periods of spring and autumn at home in Vermore. While transhumance is predominantly male enterprise, entire families tended to move to the plains in the harsh winters, when the place would be practically isolated from the rest of the state and the country and the world at large. However, some qualifications are needed here because there is a widespread association of the region with the Gadi. First, there are groups other than the Gadi, such as the scheduled caste, Rehada, Sipi, and Hali, who never practiced pastoralism. Second, even the Gadi, as Richard Axelby writes, have never been pure nomads, but rather combine pastoralism with farming and other activities. And third, very few families practice it anymore. So this is basically what the geography of it, the community is. So Vermore, so Mani Mahesh is the center of the universe in some ways, because being the abode of Lord Shiva. Vermore is the center of his chosen people, the Gadi. Their pastures in the winters are out here across the Dhauladhar range in Kangra. If you've been to Dharamshala and so on, those regions, Nurpur, Kangra, Dharamshala. And in the summers, they go as far as Kelang in Lahore, and further in the Lahore Valley and beyond. So it's a very expansive scale of social reproduction. So it's always an irony for me that supposedly that this Gadi group is read as an isolated tribe. And when you look at the scale of their sort of livelihood, it expands far, far beyond what you would imagine an isolated community to live like. Still, the purported backwardness and isolation of Gadi has contributed to the region being a notified tribal area, and therefore the beneficiary of constitutional provisions as well as state grants. These have, as scholars have noted, further accelerated the process of sedentarization of the Gadi pastoralists with relatively high literacy rates, access to jobs, and a thriving horticultural economy centered on apple cultivation. So basically, apples have also taken over the region in the last couple of decades. Scholars of the Gadi have thus called for attention to other aspects of their way of life than just pure pastoral cultural economy, including diasporic experiences and what Christopher calls a post-pastoral enactment of place, which is an agenda that I believe urbanizing Vermore is an ideal ground to study. So already by 2005, these are two images of Burma from 2000. I don't know how clear it is on your screen, but just in these 10 years, you can see the sort of way the settlement is changing, new construction going on all over the place. Already by 2005, historian O.C. Anda could write the following. He says, spilled over beyond its seams, with high-rise concrete buildings popping up everywhere, Burma of today is a humming little town. This process is only accelerated since then. These are two maps that we created based on our fieldwork. The survey of Burma's built environment already in 2018 reported a total of 391 units, of which 135 were being put to commercial use. Only 26 independent wood and stone blocks, the older kind of housing, remained, while 66 had concrete construction attached to older wooden units, like the Bharadwaj family I started with. There were 52 exclusively concrete buildings in town, and 44 more were under construction. So in a sense, a fifth or a fourth of the town was under construction at once. And you can imagine how things would have been like since then. Although with the pandemic, of course, things also have changed. The Chaurasi temple complex you can see on this map is like the center of the settlement, traditional center of the settlement, although it has also changed with the highway sort of taking this highway has been recently classified as national highway. And so some of the sort of commercial activities are now occurring along the highway rather than the older center. There is also a helipad because it being so quote unquote isolated from the rest of the world. So for emergency healthcare and so on, so you require helipads, as well as for Chief Minister and others to basically visit this place, because no one's going to drive 10 hours from Shimla. And also to the Mani Mahesh Yatra, you can now take commercial helicopter ride, and it will drop you straight at the lake rather than having to trek up there. There are different typologies of housing, just so that you get a visual sense of what things are like. So you have some very large constructions, sort of large constructions, and you can see the modular nature of the one right in front of us, which basically tells you that this is for rental, for renting out, so by room. Then there are these kinds of constructions, smaller units, which are for self-use mostly. The one on the left is interesting because it's one of those that I mentioned where you connect, where you build the new next to the old. So you have in this image, you can see the older structure and it sort of gets connected to the new concrete structure. And then there are commercial establishments, buildings that are for retail, for go downs and such things. So from space, now we move to space-time. Urban life is composed of a multiplicity of intersecting temporalities. Some activities, government offices, for example, operate within regimented time, while others like online food delivery services cannot be predicted and evolve real time. While most livelihoods are earned during the late daytime, as we know, others are nocturnal. Spaces also change in use, character, and meaning depending on time. Footpaths in places like Old Delhi, where our one campus of our university is, that are used not only to walk on, but also for street vending during the day, become sites for resting and sleep at night for migrants, migrant workers, and those going through homelessness. Time not only shapes the social, spatial lives and possibilities, but itself is also constantly structured by the latter. So spatial temporal dynamics are a productive lens, I believe, to study the urban, especially urbanizing context, because they become a site for larger social processes, negotiation, and contestations. Whose time is to prevail? Whose time is to dominate? This section thinks through this idea by considering time in Burma through two scales, the macro and the micro. In terms of the macro temporalities, the larger scalar temporalities, the region's rhythms are strongly influenced first by the historical Gaddi pastoralist time that follows seasonality. The seasonality itself is tied to environmental dynamics in terms of weather and ecology, since biomass availability in pastures at different climatic zones varies across the year. And also your ability to reach pastures depends on whether the passes are open or not. Like most aspects of life and space in the Gadda, these rhythms are ascribed ritual meaning and also connect to Lord Shiva's movements. Here, Molly Kaushal, who wrote this excellent monograph in 2001, talks about how Shiv makes Mani Mahesh Mountain his abode for 6 months of the year before migrating to the Netherlands, the Pialpur in the winters. Thus, the nomadic Shiva, patterning the life of his devotees after his own, has regulated the rhythm of the Gaddi lifestyle with these two distinct shifts, that is, summer months in situ and winters in the foothills. Over the last generation, many Gaddi who had rights to pastures in Kangra in the foothills beyond the Dhauladhar mountains, if you remember the map, have actually permanently settled in places like Dharamshala and Nurpur. Since these areas are seen to provide greater access to educational institutions and employment, several more have built a second home in the foothills where they spend the winter months in continuation of the Gaddi seasonal movement, even though they do not practice pastoralism anymore. So there is this connection to the older sort of rhythms and older movements, even though you're not taking sheep and goat anymore, but you just sort of leave and stay there for 3 or 4 months and then come back in the spring. So Bharmor's population as a result dwindles at the approach of winter, and economic activity cease to a large extent. During interviews we conducted in December 2017, many families were preparing to move to their or their relatives' homes in Kangra. There are also those who remain in Bharmor for one or the other reason, but even the rhythms of their lives change dramatically. So Mukesh, a 35-year-old from the non-Gaddi scheduled caste Rehara caste, has nowhere to go. He says, from the end of December, it will snow for 2 or 3 months. We put together everything, wood, LPG in advance. Then for those months, we live a repetitive life. Wake up and take in the sun. There is nothing else to do. No one visits Bharmor. In March, work picks up again. This historical time then is shaped by the seasonality of pastoralism. The first temporality at the macro scale. The second is what one can call late colonial, post-colonial developmental time. So scholars have explored the idea of linearity, progress, teleology, even in the development discourse, as well as its tendency, as Laura Baer calls it, to order hierarchically, separate, and adjudicate between other social times. The notion that certain places are backward, quote unquote backward, but through a series of often formulaic interventions can be brought forward to the state of development remain pervasive. Such notion of status and therefore backwardness inform state projects organized around quote unquote tribal development, which have been well funded since the 1970s in Himachal. Entire paraphernalia of state agencies has come up in places like Bharmor to implement projects designed to mainstream, quote unquote, the supposedly isolated Gaddi tribal groups through the priority extension of roads, electricity, education, healthcare, as well as loans towards setting up small businesses. It is another matter that, as seen in the previous paragraph, Gaddi are a mobile group, I already said that, who have been materially and culturally connected to societies far beyond Bharmor for centuries. The third macro-temporality here is that of state capitalism, of which smart urbanism, which is sort of the key buzzword today, can be viewed as the latest avatar. I use these forces, state and capitalism, in tandem because this is how they operate. The artifacts produced by the ideology of linear developmental time become the infrastructure that allow the circulation of capital and try to reconfigure time according to their logics. Time is, of course, the basic unit of capital, the primary constituent of value and the ingredient of workers' exploitation. The essential tendency of capital to save time, quote unquote, save time, whether in production, distribution, or turnover, produces a dynamic world of technology, logistics, and marketing, leading to what Marx termed as the annihilation of space by time. Urban areas in capitalism display what Henri Lefebvre had described as the fast temporality of simultaneity. And through networks, economics, social, and personal lives, capital actively tries to flatten time. Certainly, state capitalist temporalities are important to the lives of people in Bharmor. If rural roads sought to connect hamlets to the mainstream in the developmental vision, highways with tunnels drilled under mountain passes look to bypass the vagaries of seasons altogether today. If traveling between Chamba and Bharmor involved knowing the bus timetable and waiting for buses, private vehicles today open the possibility of flexible time of travel. And if landline phones, already operational since the 1980s, meant that those in Bharmor could speak with their relatives across the Dhauladhar, now they exchange photographs, videos, and messages instantaneously on WhatsApp or Facebook. As critical geographers, though, have shown that while this is indeed a tendency, in dialectical fashion, space also bends time by introducing path dependency and bottlenecks, thus defining the field of possibilities, what capital is able to do and not. It's not given that it will actually flatten time. There are then, as Apple, Anand, and Akhil Gupta write, heterogeneous forms of pacing, duration, waiting, pause, obsolescence, and delay that also characterize capital's generative rhythms. The imperative to speed things up, especially through massive infrastructures, is often connected with the element of risk, as we very well know, especially in the Himalayan region, where earthquakes, landslides, and flash floods are common and are occurring with increased frequency and intensity, climate change. So moving on to understand the temporalities on the ground at the scale at which everyday lives unfold, I consider what can be termed the time of building, that is of construction, not of large state or capital driven infrastructures, but of housing by individuals from different social and economic classes. So in this section, I detail these three, especially taking time on two, but three micro-temporalities of construction: seasonal, incremental, and the smooth. Each of these is tied to locally circulating capital, to macro time, but also to ideas of the future and people's aspirations, whether or not they are actually concretized. So the first temporality of building here is rhythmic and seasonal, and like pastoralism, intricately tied to weather patterns and the environment. As winter arrives and is accelerated by the first snowfall, like I said, a chunk of Barmore makes its way across Dholadash to the Kangra Valley. As Mukesh expressed it earlier, even those who remain in Barmore have little to do but wait out the winters, gather around their tandoor, the heating stove, exchanging stories. It is as if space and time are decompressed in the winters in Barmore before they are sped up again with the onset of spring. The result of this pastoralism inflected seasonality is that town life enters a slower, relaxed routine. So while RCC, reinforced concrete cement, is in principle a much faster means of construction than the traditional wooden structures, which involve specialized, painstaking work, taking a month just to polish the wood. I mean, that's the kind of pace we're talking about. Of one door, often 15 days for one door. That's the pace which is sped up by RCC. And yet it is difficult to build around this seasonal rhythm in Barmore. As a Brahmin couple with both wife and husband retired from government service told us, they said, even no one is around in the winters in Barmore. And in the summers, there is a shortage of workers and masons. So it takes very long to construct a house here. We started a building in 1998. We finished only in 2005. From the perspective of capital, speeding up the process of construction shortens the turnover for the contractor and the labor. And yet faster construction is materially fraught as well in these zones. Chand Kapoor, a cement wholesaler, told us that because the snow does not melt for a couple of months at least in Barmore, it seeps into the structure and destroys the slab. Yaqub, a mason from Chamba working in Barmore, put it this way. He said, people want work done quickly, but when you work fast, the job is not that good. For example, as I drink my tea right now, if I chug it down, I will burn myself. But if I do it slowly, I will enjoy it. He says, maza aega. The most common temporality of building in Barmore proceeds incrementally. This logic of infrastructural configuration is, of course, well trodden in critical urban studies and infrastructure literature, and in fact, may be considered the mode by which things get built in the global south. Financial constraints, litigations, people resistance ensure that planned linearity of even large-scale projects is frequently disrupted. To be sure, not all construction is necessarily incremental, even in a place like Barmore. Those with the requisite capital may build at one go smoothly, though of course adjusting for seasonal patterns. It is the buildings of those with limited access to savings that display the rhythm of incrementalism. When we asked people about the construction of their houses or shops, we mostly heard stories about taking years, about building piece by piece, as one respondent said, jod kar, and about the struggles to save enough to build a home one aspires to. So one interlocutor asserted, he said, it is impossible to estimate the time it takes to build. We built as we saved money. If I had money now, this house would be finished in no time. Another interlocutor, retired as a lineman from the Indian Railways, told us how he assembled the materials slowly from different places, wood from Jassur in Kangra, some material from Chamba town, others from Pathankot. At some point, the family just simply ran out of money to build without them being able to complete the fixtures and the roofing. There are many such buildings around Burma which exist in such suspension, etching into the ground the idea, and I quote Akhil Gupta here, that completion is not the only possible outcome once a project begins. Such projects can be suspended for short periods or forever. In their study of concrete in Sikkim, McDoy Ra and Chetri see, as they call it, cluster of steel rods protruding up or out from parts of a completed dwelling as images of optimism and aspiration. That's what it signifies to them. In Burma, however, these same elements actually I found to be reminders of the personal struggles and sacrifices it takes for many to build, and of the enervating, weakening quality of unfinished homes, anxiety-causing qualities of unfinished homes. Furthermore, these buildings on tight budgets cut various corners to save costs and end up with significantly weaker structures. Pressing concerns for a geological active region like the Western Himalaya. We were told how instead of a 16mm steel rod that a 2 or 3 floor building requires, 10mm rods will be used alongside cheaper cement that is less likely to withstand the cold Burma winters by those who were absolutely desperate to build but did not have enough money saved up. Class in this way is really concretized into the fragile landscape, producing an uneven geography of risk. So let me just briefly conclude with a few remarks. The greater inflow of cash due to employment within and outside the region, horticulture and increased commercial opportunities have transformed Burma in so many ways. The rapid pace of change as seen in the recent and ongoing construction draws different emotional and material responses. Residents seek to position themselves depending on the reading of the future to give them the best chance of surviving or thriving even. Whether the future is an external force one must prepare for or a set of opportunities one can aspire to are related to the experiences of the recent past. Many trace the recent changes in their own lives and in the town's geographies and project the trajectories forward in a somewhat linear manner to a future with even greater prosperity. There are anxieties about the densities though. At the same time, there are anxieties about the increasing density, the difficulties in accessing services, about the changing demographics, and about the environmental consequences of the settlement. At the intimate scale, concrete construction is associated with several health concerns because the concrete walls and the marble floors do not regulate temperatures well. People speak about getting asthma from inhaling the smoke since they must sit by the fire through the cold days and nights in concrete homes, while bemoaning the difficulties in constructing with wood anymore. Others felt that with increasing population, the existing infrastructures will be overstretched. Since Burma is classified as a rural panchayat, there are no funds earmarked specifically for urban infrastructures. Further, there is no planning or building code since rural settlements remain outside the Town and Country Planning Acts. The slightly crooked Mani Mahesh temple in Chorasi complex is a reminder of the Kangra earthquake of 1905, which leveled the entire region. Just as the 2015 Nepal earthquake is a strong portent of looming catastrophe, which many new infrastructures may not collapse. So considering some of the concerns around urbanizing time in smart city or other urban debates, most particularly the whole focus on accelerated urbanization, from Burma demands attention to history, to entrenched structures that shape temporalities, and to the contextual shape otherwise dominant temporal practices are forced to take. They also demand that the smart characteristics of agility and hyperconnectedness are tempered by the equally smart qualities of wisdom and resourcefulness when we think of urban futurities. So during one conversation with a 40-year-old male shop owner who took early retirement from his job as a school teacher to start the business, this shop, we asked him how he compares the two vocations. So turning common linear sense on its head a little bit, he told us that teaching was tough and now he led a relaxed life, adding that he too had a right to time pass. So the diverse meanings of time and their intersections in life are, in conclusion, productive point of entry into the urban, especially in the time of the dominant, constrictive, and often technocratic policy paradigms. And this, I just finished with this image because this is one of these homes that has been constructed in Bharmar where people are moved in, and this here is the kitchen. And apart from all the paraphernalia, I love this, this photograph of a sheep. It sort of is a reminder of pastoralist, past and present, and also perhaps ideas of future. So thanks so much once again. Just to acknowledge some of the scholars I've worked with, former students and RAs, and some of the funding for this project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rohit, for this fascinating paper and for sharing your labor of love in this forum. In fact, if we look at, trends in terms of social scientists, they hardly pay a scant attention to the study of the small town, frontiers town, or like the small urbanizations in these tribal areas. So listening to you, I've been reminded of the work by this Dolikikon and Duncan on their book on the ceasefire city, wherein, studying about the Dimapur, they position it as a frontier city, a borderland city or a ceasefire city. It unveiled the coexistence and in many ways, the cooperation between commercial, military, insurgent groups during the both commercial booms in the ceasefire period. So listening to your talk, I was, like trying to reflect back, trying to echo in the context of the Northeast India, and particularly on the point which you are talking about, the temporalities and the suspension of infrastructure, which you also echo about the perspective of Akhil. For that matter, I think the temporalities and the suspension of infrastructure in Northeast India is not new, but often it is a recurring phenomena. And not only that, it goes beyond one level to what is, this Northeastern Council, they call it as an orphanage road, orphan roads, where the roads are being abandoned, not only suspended, but it's been abandoned. So looking at the larger this theoretical discourse in infrastructure, especially on this social anthropology of infrastructure, when you look at about is the materiality, the poetics, aesthetics, the technopolitics, and the social dynamics of infrastructure, in fact, it reveals the interesting terrains for theorizations, which your paper has in fact done an excellent job for that matter. So infrastructure, when they look at that, it occupies, a unique position and also relevance in this contemporaneous development discourse. Particularly if I echo that in the context of the Northeast India, infrastructure development, in fact, refracts the ideology of development, because there is also a concept where there's an infrastructural deficit region, or also the infrastructure of injustice, and also the infrastructure, those are infrastructurally lagging. So infrastructure, what I was being reminded of the work of these Howin and others, wherein they say infrastructure from social science perspective, the infrastructure is also material, like roads, pipes, sewers, grids, housing. At the same time, it is also social, institutions like economic systems in media form. And they go on to arguing that it is also a philosophical, wherein intellectual tragedies, dream of the human ingenuity and nail down in this concrete form. And again, when I look at the work of this Star and root letters, wherein they hold that infrastructure is a relational concept, where you also in your paper also brought up about the temporalities and then the multiple temporalities and also layers of that. So for that matter, infrastructure becomes in relations to organized practices. So looking also not only that, the work of this Brand Larkin, especially his paper on this politics and the poetic of infrastructure. Wherein he theorized about the built-in network, the infrastructure that facilitated the flow of goods, people, and ideas. So looking at that larger debate, infrastructure, in fact, does entail a webs of network foregrounding that both materiality as well as non-material dimensions such as like aesthetics, poetic, building, social relation, and among others. So here, when I look at about this emerging this urban space or a small town predominantly, inhabited by tribals in the region like Northeast is fraught with certain complexities, as it tends to defy the existing dominant social theories and framework, and also consequently, inaccurately situated and explained. So I feel that your studies have in fact given us a way forward in order to approach this small town. So it's imperative to critically examine and also the making and the unmaking of this small town from such different structures. So having said that, I was kind of curious when you talk about these multiple temporalities. So is there also a layers in terms of different social categories when talks about this multiple temporalities? And on the second aspect, I would like to know in terms of the methodology, in terms of how you conceptualize these macro temporalities vis-a-vis that of the micro temporalities. And my last question is about, is there a kind of the interactions or contestation between tribe and non-tribal in terms of this built environment? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ziipao. I mean, you also very well laid out some of the larger concerns or questions that some of the infrastructure studies, infrastructure literature has been looking at. What my entry is a bit different. My entry is more, I would say, from the urban studies side, not necessarily from the infrastructure side, although there is a degree of overlap. And there, as you might have seen, I'm very interested in the building practices and inhabiting practices of people, and from that scale upwards. And I think that that sometimes we get less of, and we have more the larger narratives of infrastructure. And I think it would be quite productive. And I think you pointed out the book by Dolly Kikon and McDoyer, recently published book. I haven't read it yet, but I think that might be, from what I know, is that it brings together visual and sort of narratives together. And so I think that is a very interesting and novel sort of way to approach these things. Okay, so on your the points you made, so few things. I don't know how well I can answer them right now. I think I need to also need time with these things. But so the tribal and non-tribal. So there is a contestation going on, and it's been going on for a while now, between the Gaddi, and the Gaddi is the population group that has been given the tribal status, and some of the other groups that are adjacent, that are part of the same society, and yet they are not considered tribal. They are given the SC status in the society. So there is aspiration and there is some sort of politics to be categorized as Gaddi on their behalf. And there is, of course, then resistance from the Gaddi to let that happen. And that politics manifests very well, not so much in the Gaddi heartland, although it also does there, but across the Dhauladars in Kangra. Because what's happened, like I said, a lot of the Gaddis have over time in the previous generation gone and settled in Kangra because they had access to the place through their earlier rhythms of pastoralism. They were able to convert, buy property and sort of build. And so there are many Gaddis in Kangra. Now, at some point in the last 15 or 20 years, I don't know exactly the date, the Gaddis in Kangra also got the ST status. Meanwhile, the other groups, the non-Gaddi groups from Barmor, they don't have ST status, and their whole point is that there is far more competition for the SC category seats in educational institutions and elsewhere, and so they want in on the ST category because they say that we are also as isolated and remote as they are, and yet through certain practice of exclusion, cultural sort of gatekeeping, they have been kept out of it. So that is an extreme interesting politics is ongoing, and there is a PhD dissertation. I mean, there's not a lot has been published, but there is a PhD dissertation on this precise politics that was done, I think, in University of British Columbia or one of these places where the scholars studied this thing. The second on the layering, and I mean, two things here. One, the meta and micro. So this is I mean, I've been at pains to explain, not so much in this shortened paper, but in the longer version, the actual written paper, that these are sort of analytical categories. There is all kinds of connections and they are intersecting, and it's very difficult to even draw them out. But I'm trying to do that just so that we have some sense of we can also analyze as to the different forces that are sort of operating in the field, in the temporal field. Why I call them meta? Because these are this structure, they create or they condition the possibilities of what you can and cannot do, while the micro is what you are actually able to practice, or how through practice you are able to mold them and change them and so on. So it's more as a setting of the field, the pastoral, the transhumant, that sort of sets the field in a historical manner. The developmental sets the field, and then within it, an individual belonging to one group or the other is sort of trying to push against, trying to either run in or swim in the same direction with the tide, or sort of is pushing back at what that time allows them or not to do. There is layering. I think one of this we did more in the other story, the Banjar, the Kullu district story, is to also do a much more sociological reading of the town, and much more of a sociological reading of the materiality of the town. This paper itself is more interested in the practices of building, construction, building, that. So I think in the future we will do more of the layering as to how time and temporality intersects with gender, for instance, how it intersects with different caste groups. We have, I have some sense, but it requires obviously much more fleshing out and work as a separate paper. There is a paper that the second paper from this will have that kind of work, and also trajectories and just stories of people, and who is in Burma at this time, why are they there, what do they see it as, where do they want to go, Michael Bass, who wrote his dissertation on and also a book on Indian students in Australia. Actually, he calls how the students consider Australia as through this concept or idea of arrival points. And he says, we all have an arrival point in our mind, where we want to end up, eventually. So for some, Australia was that, but for others, Australia was simply a waypoint. It was a station in their journey towards some other arrival point that could be back in India, or could be in the US or elsewhere. Similarly, Bharmor has a different meaning for different people. It is where someone wants to settle. It is where someone wants to just go and get their education. Someone wants a shop to be owned, and then they want to go live in Dharamshala or in Shimla or Delhi or Chandigarh or elsewhere. So the second sort of text that I anticipate, I mean, I've already written some part of it, will go more into that, the sort of nuances of different groups and different individuals, different socially positioned individuals, and how they see their lives in this town. But I'm hopeful that, I can only cover so much ground. Someone who's better equipped than me to study some of these things will take it forward. I mean, and sort of doesn't have to be Burma, could be another place. But with some sort of ground covered, I really hope, like, it could be Nagal and could be elsewhere, but we get a sense of small towns through these kinds of intersections, through these layering, and we get a larger picture of what's going on. So my contribution is more in a particular sort of narrow area within that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your elaborate response. Now, may I invite questions from the audience? If you have any question, please, you can ask, or you can type down in the chat box.
Okay. Thanks, Rocky. I have a small question, Rohit. So thanks for this talk, because I think it gives us a way to make sense of this emerging field of study, even in the Northeast. I think of late, the whole question of urbanization has attracted lots of attention among the scholars. And then I think we have a couple of books which have, including Rocky's book, which have come up. So I wonder if you, this particular query that I'm going to put across had formed a part of your research. For example, in the emerging a scenario of an urbanization, right, in a once pastoral society. What we are witnessing as per your study is this multiple temporalities, and then differential spaces in one particular location. So now, what happened to the solidarity, in a once close-knitted pastoral society? Is there a new sense of solidarity being articulated, and how does that solidarity sort of traverse multiple temporalities? I'm just kind of, I don't know if you had actually encountered this particular scenario in your research, but I'm just interested in that.
Yeah, thanks, Nixon. So I would put it a little bit differently, at least from the way I've been thinking about it. Is solidarity is one subset of it, I think, but the larger issue is collectivity. Like, what kinds of new collectives? How are people? What can we say about the associational lives of people? Because we individuals in general, and particularly in these contexts where capital is not yet that entrenched, there are even long-lasting collective lives, long-lasting associational lives. So the question is, who are you associating with? Under what terms? And are those new associations the same or similar to what you were doing in the previous generation, or is there movement? Is there change? And to that extent, there is definitely, within certain limits, greater inter-community association, greater inter-caste association. And I will say two things on that. One, that colleges, schools, hangouts, places places that you basically spend time in for recreation, they allow for opportunities to interact with people that you would not have if you were in a village that still remains entrenched in very strong sort of caste hierarchies. And those caste hierarchies are always spatialized. There are parts of a village with one group, and there are parts of the village with another group. And sort of the entire surveillance infrastructure of the village is geared towards preventing people from mixing, right? So those things to some extent break down in the town, because there are just a greater number of people. There are a greater number of blind spots of that surveillance infrastructure. There are places, behind the college, some place which is not lit well, where you can mingle, in a sense. And yet there is a way in which caste also sort of shapeshifts. It also changes its way of operation. So one story from, not from Bharmor, but from Banjar, the other town, is that, in the Anganwadi, the daycare for little kids, you have kids from all the neighborhood, and the neighborhood is a multi-caste neighborhood, multi-community neighborhood. And yet, before lunch, many families, the upper caste families, will pull out the children and take them home, because they don't want the kids to share food with those belonging to another caste. So it's such a dynamic thing. I don't want to say with with authority in that it is completely changing and that you will have completely new associational lives and new collectivities. Nor do I want to be fully pessimistic and saying, oh, it's unchanging. There is something going on which has elements of both. I think it needs, like I was saying earlier to Dr. Ziipao, that we need more work focused on these things. The other thing, the second thing I wanted to say about this is politics is so locally entrenched in Himachal. Party politics. It is so entrenched. Panchayat elections are the battleground. I mean, much more than national elections, the panchayat elections are the battleground, local battlegrounds. Those who live in Chamba, who live in Dharamshala, but who have a voter ID card back in Bharmor, people will be calling them come back, and they do it as a sense of duty. They come back and vote in the panchayat elections. They won't care so much in the Lok Sabha elections, but they do care about the panchayat election. And local life is so sharply divided along BJP versus Congress. And in Himachal, in the last 30 years, this is how it's been. We have a BJP government for 5 years, Congress for 5 years, then BJP, Congress. It's like a pendulum. It swings between the two. And so much is tied to it. Not only the sense, ideology, but actually materially. There are those contractors and others who are tied to one party. There are others that are tied to other party. You get work when your party comes to power. You don't get work when the other. Then there are government employees, and someone needs to do this ethnography of transfers in Himachal Pradesh, because an inordinate time of even the minister is spent in just arbitrating transfer requests. Someone is a college lecturer in one town, someone is a school teacher or a doctor in another village or town. They spend, like, the minute they are transferred someplace, they start petitioning for going back to their hometown or somewhere. And there is and who gets which posting? So Bharmor, Pangi, another tribal area, Kinnaur, Spiti. I'm sure some of you might know about Spiti and such places. They are considered historically as punishment posting. So if BJP comes to power, you are a Congressy school teacher, very sure you're going to be transferred to Spiti or one of these places. So and all of this has so even while you have associations that go back in terms of your relationships. I mean, through well, as being relatives. I mean, those kind of relationships. Even those are divided sharply along political lines. So I think both of these things are very critical in terms of what we're studying.
Others, if you have questions, please feel free. Yeah. I don't know how much time do we have, Mr. President, for discussions?
I think we can take one or two questions if there are questions.
Okay. Questions or comments? Two last questions or comments, please.
Okay, then thank you, Jer. Let me ask few questions. Now, one is a general question. I mean, this is an issue that I've been grappling with for a long time, especially the theories from the West, and I would say those who follow the Marxist tradition. Of course, from Marcuse has also written about it. They think that tribal life is the last refuge, or the last the solution to the problems of the modern Western society. And also a lot of theories that have followed the Marxist tradition has posited the tribal life as some sort of the alternatives to Western lifestyle. But so I'm wondering, if we look at the life of these small communities in the Himalayan mountains, whether this alternatives is actually losing out, whether the alternative communities that follow alternative lifestyles, alternative housing patterns, alternative notion of time, whether they are actually on the verge of extinction. In terms of their way of life, in terms of thinking, not in terms of the population and the community. So, and that's actually what troubles me. And then looking at urbanization, whether the Western notion of life, time has actually encroached into this traditional way of life. Secondly, I'm also interested at the notion of time. When we look at the notion of time and then tribal notion of time and the Western notion of time, they're follow different patterns, different philosophy altogether. So whether you have looked at the intersection between these two notions of time and space, between the modern, say, urbanized notion of time and space and the traditional notion of time and space, is there any kind of hybridity that is emerging? That's what actually I'm concerned about. Thank you.
Should I answer, or should we get maybe?
You can answer.
You're making a last call for. Okay, so excellent points, especially the second one, because you've basically summarized my whole paper really well, really succinctly. Maybe I should have been as sharp as you are. What I was trying to argue is that there are powerful temporalities, forces, fields that sort of structure time, development, mainstreaming, forward march of communities and so on, that sort of ideas. And then there is the seasonal pastoral time, which itself is changing. It's not like it wasn't changing. It's and that somehow there is an external imposition. No, it's a longer process. And the point I was making towards the end is that it's not like the first has replaced the other, that the authentic or the sort of historical has given way or become somewhat extinct, as you put it. Rather, the developmental and capital time has to mold, has to shape itself to fit the seasonal, to fit the pastoral, to fit the existing. And so the question is, to what extent is it able to what extent, what are we finding, the kinds of rhythms or temporalities that people are living and building with, which are they closer to? And really, it's you're right, it's some kind of hybrid, but which is really where even the powerful time of the smart and the capitalist, urban capitalist, has to also sort of agree to work with the pastoralist time. So it's not one way street, is what I'm trying to argue. And that also goes back to the other point that you're making, on which I have fewer opinions actually, because because I don't believe in fixed in kind of fixing time or lives as one or the other. They're always changing, always evolving. The question is about autonomy. To me, the question is about autonomy. The question is about space are you changing? At who defines the possibilities of change? Are those something that you are deciding and you are negotiating, or are they given from outside elsewhere? That is the key question. And I think this is where there might be some, when you just about the infrastructures of injustice, as you called it, I think there might be some interesting points of comparison between Himachal and the Northeast. Because in Himachal, there is a sense of autonomy. People are consciously, autonomously moving to a certain kind of rhythm and a certain kind of space and life. To a large extent, I'm not saying that's entirely true. Certainly, there are issues around hydropower and displacement and so on. But for places like Vermont and many others, the pace is being negotiated and is being sort of debated locally, and we see some kind of a resolution or some sort of temporary, strategic, tactical kind of movement that people have agreed to work with. So I think that's an important difference here, that perhaps I should have spent more time with, but certainly because you have much more of a sense about Nagaland and Northeast than I do. So I'm sure you would have been thinking about these things as I read the paper.
Yeah, good evening. I take this time on behalf of the NSA Executive Council and the NSA family to thank Dr. Rohit and also Dr. Raile Ziipao for your presence and your participation this evening. Thank you, Dr. Raile Ziipao, for chairing the session this evening. We sincerely appreciate your support to NSA family, and we look forward to having you with us again. Thank you, Dr. Rohit, for being part of our October talk this evening. And we want to thank you for bringing your expertise and experience around the table and engaging in such fruitful, constructive, and open exchanges. And we still have a lot to learn from your knowledge and experience. And so, Dr. Rohit, we look forward to having you with us again. I also extend our heartfelt gratitude to all the attendees joining us from different parts of India this evening. It is always a delight and an encouragement for us to see people showing your support with your presence. Indeed, it is a beautiful indication that we need each other to grow. We look forward to having you all again next month in our October talk. Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.